Hello and welcome, everybody. It's such a great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's conversation, a conversation between Linda Colley and Maya Jasanoff. They're here, of course, to discuss Professor Colley's new book, just out, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, Warfare, Constitutions, and the Making of the Modern World. I'm going to just hold it up for a second so that we have it sort of in our mind's eye as we talk. And it's just out, like I said, and has already been recognized by Jill Lepore in an amazing piece in the New Yorker that I saw yesterday as a masterpiece. In a minute, I will introduce our guests and then I'll bring them up on the screen. But first, I want to give a quick shout out and thank you to Princeton University's History Department and Princeton's Humanities Council. They're our co-sponsors for tonight and were a great help in getting word out. And then I want to point out two important buttons on the bottom of your screen. The long one, a sort of green long one, is a link to buy a copy of The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen from Labyrinth. And if you enter Colley at checkout, you'll get 10% off on your entire order. If you prefer to order over the phones or send us an email, I've put all that information in the chat. And then there's an Ask a Question button. You'll see that someone has already found that. And it's just that. It's the place to put your questions as you think of them. And then I will be taking the chat down actually during the conversation. So please use that button instead and feel encouraged to put your questions in the queue as you think of them. And that will actually help us make sure that we leave enough time for the Q&A. So now on to our guests. I just mentioned Jill Lepore's glowing review of Linda Colley's new book, from which I will quote only a sentence. If there were a Nobel Prize in history, Lepore writes, Colley would be my nominee. And in some ways, enough said. But so just a few brief biographical details in addition. Linda, who is professor of history here at Princeton and also a fellow of the British Academy, as well as at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, started out as a historian of Britain, but for a long time now, her work has centered on global history. I won't list all of her acclaimed and prize-winning books. I will just mention the early and influential Britons, Forging a Nation, since the interest in nation-making is really still at work in her new book now on constitutions. And then Captives and The Ordeal of Elizabeth Marsh, which are books from which we know her as an expert explorer of the long trajectories of ideas, of identities across the globe. That skill is now reconfirmed by the vivid examples in The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, which are from Corsica to Russia to Pitcairn Island to Tokyo, with lots of stops in between. And how very great that Maya Jasanoff, Linda's former student here at Princeton, now professor of history at Harvard, can join us tonight. Her interests overlap with Linda's. She is the author of 3 also celebrated, also prize-winning and best-selling books. They are Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World, which won the National Book Critics Award, among other awards. Edge of Empire, Lives, Culture, and Conquest in the East, 1750 to 1850. And The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World. My copy of The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen just arrived late last week, but I will say this since it's already abundantly clear. Throughout the book, Linda plumbs the gulf between aspiration and achievement. So how is it that constitutions, which are documents so deeply associated with emancipation and peace and human rights, how is it that they have so often been produced in tandem with imperialism and war, with violence? And we learned very quickly that that is not so much a paradox as it is a causal link. Linda also reminds us that constitutions don't simply enact, they also narrate, and they tell a story about a nation and its people. So here now to pull at some of the threads of these many varied stories and their underlying themes and lessons are Linda, Colley, and Maya Jasanoff. I just have to click two buttons to bring them up to you. So welcome, Linda. And
it's wonderful to be here.
Good. And now, Maya. Hi, Maya.
Hi.
Good to have you both. And I will just duck out and let the two of you take it away.
Hello, Linda. Hello, audience. It's lovely to quote unquote see you here and have this chance to celebrate this achievement. The gun, the ship, and the pen. And I wanted to kick off by, well, first I should alert the audience to the fact that, as Dorothea just mentioned, this is a book that is truly global. This phrase global history is used very widely these days to refer, I think, to histories that take on board more than one place. But between these covers are the histories of Pitcairn Island and Japan and Russia and the United States and South America and Nigeria. This is a truly global history. And it, I think, demonstrates something that you do exceptionally well, which is to pull together the histories of politics and ideas with the histories of people and practices on multiple scales. So I'm hoping that in our conversation, some of that will become clear to the audience. I wanted to kick things off, though, by asking you, when you first started working on this project, you characterized it as a history of constitutions. And yet the first two words of the title are gun and ship. So this manifestly became a history about something well beyond constitutions. Can you tell us about how a book about constitutions became a book as well about war?
Well, I suppose I wanted, when I set out on this book and finally worked out what it was about, because as you know, it takes some time to work out what you're writing. I wanted really to do two things. Constitutions, different varieties of constitutions go back a long way in different societies to ancient times. But I wanted to trace the takeoff from about 1750, whereby you get rather different constitutions that are mass-produced, printed, published, and they start spreading at an exponential rate across continents. And I wanted to tell that story and explain what happened. And I quickly realized that I could not tell the story without looking at war. War, in many ways, is more important in this story than revolution, though war and revolution interlink. The other thing I really wanted to do was to take constitutions out of the rather narrow, compartmentalized slots in which they were often kept, that these were rather arid, specialist documents. When I started this project and would tell people what I was doing, they would say, "Oh, constitutions, that's interesting." And I wanted to take them out of just the story of the nation states. I wanted to look at them as more than just specialist legal and political texts.
So, there are many, many ways in which you unsettle the cliches and stereotypes that I think most Americans carry around about constitutions. Perhaps foremost, the kind of reverence that Americans hold constitutions in, and this is threaded so thoroughly through the book that I think many different angles on it will become clear. But one of the things that I was particularly struck by is that one could imagine a book about constitutions that would have the founding fathers and their quill pens around a polished oak table, and that's not at all where you begin. You give us instead, for example, Catherine the Great, with her quill pen setting out to write a new order. So can you tell us a bit about, who with whom does your picture of constitutions really begin, and why those people, and what were their aims in getting involved in the writing of constitutions?
Well, as my accent suggests, I'm an outsider in this game. I come from what is still one of the few countries on the face of the globe that doesn't have a codified constitution. So for me, at one level, these are very exotic documents. But I also didn't have that kind of instinctive reverence that you describe, which is partly why I wanted to start the book in the 1750s because that made historical sense. But I also wanted to do it to signal that what happens in Philadelphia in 1787 is not the start of the game. And as for Catherine the Great, women and issues of gender are part of this story in all sorts of ways. But I really wanted not just to talk about how women were excluded from constitution, but also to get a female actor. And Catherine the Great was, with the rather wonderful Nakaz, or instruction, that she composes in the 1760s, which is published in so many languages, was a marvelous example. And of course, she's such a great character. And I was very pleased to write about her because even today, she is written about and, of course, presented in media very much in regard to her not-so-private life. And her ideas and her political acts are relatively ignored, except by Russian specialists. So for all sorts of reasons, I wanted to bring her into the story. Here is someone thinking about iconic texts before 1776, never mind 1787.
She also is one of many figures interested in constitutions who, again, to disrupt an American cliche, are not particularly inclined toward democracy in any way, shape, or form. It's an American assumption that constitutions go with republicanism, democracy, expansion of rights, and so on. And yet, in your book, there are many examples of how they are used to reinforce imperial, not to say dictatorial, power. And I was particularly struck in this regard by your portrayal of Napoleon as a figure in the history of constitutions. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the role of constitutions in empire building and, frankly, dictatorial rule.
Well, I have to say that, and if I shock my many American friends in the audience, I apologize, but I don't think many of the men who assembled in Philadelphia in 1787 would have seen themselves as Democrats, not as regards women, not as regards most blacks, not as regards indigenous people, not as regards even of poor white males in some cases. So democracy, uneven thread in the story. But why did I want to stress empire? Well, partly for the same reason I wanted to stress monarchy. The idea that constitutions are overwhelmingly to do with republics, not so. They can't be, because certainly up to the First World War, most states outside the Americas are still monarchies. And many of these states already have codified constitutions. Empires, too, are using constitutions increasingly. Napoleon does so with great calculation. I really enjoyed writing about Napoleon, who loved writing and also, of course, loved fighting. But he likes using the printed and manuscript word. And what he hopes to do by issuing and sometimes writing constitutions for his European conquest is cement his control over them. He's quite happy to give them male democracy if that's what they want. Not women, of course. He's quite happy to do religious toleration, emancipated stuff in that way. But what he wants in return is their manpower and their taxes. And the connection between constitution and getting wartime finance and wartime manpower is very, very close.
So, you said it just at the outset of our conversation that the 1750s was the natural place to start the story, because this is, of course, an era of global war on an unprecedented scale. Can you sketch out a little bit more, sort of who stood to benefit from these kinds of documents? I mean, after all, war had been going on for a very long time. So what is it that's special about the mid-18th century and thereafter that makes this instrument surge?
Well, as I say, they're not absolutely new. England had experimented with its own version of a written constitution in the 1650s, paradoxically. But what starts making them work more from the mid-18th century are, I think, two things. First of all, that print and literacy are spreading faster, so that you can use these documents in new ways. You're not just issuing things and nobody really knows they're there. They can be read and they can be reproduced in newspapers and stuck on walls and things like that. That's one thing. You've got much easier ways of communication. But in addition, you've got various pressures to do often with war. As I say, at one level, rulers are wanting to raise more men, they're wanting to raise more taxes. They begin to think how they can do that. And a constitution is a kind of contract very often. We will give you, the males, more rights. We will give you more religious toleration. But in return, you will accept conscription and you will accept increased taxation. But also you're getting pressure from below. And that interested me too. And I suppose the great classic example of that, who I talk about, is Tom Payne, who, the only job that Tom Payne manages to hold on to for any part of his life is as a tax collector. He collects excise taxes in England, which is the main tax that the British use to finance war. And as Payne collects these taxes, he begins to develop a critique of the state. And this is another way that war, taxation, state demands are feeding into the rise of constitutional thought and enthusiasm. Payne begins to say, well, what we need constitutions for is to limit the power of the rulers, so that they're not just skimming taxes off us and making us fight. The organization of the state now affects far more of us, and therefore we should think of ways of controlling the exercise of power.
So one of the other great figures who plays a big role in the book is Jeremy Bentham. And another of the cliches about constitutions in the English-speaking world is, of course, as you've already alluded to, that Britain doesn't have a written constitution. Oh, how wonderful is it that they have this unwritten, set of conventions. And yet, as you show, the British were enthusiastic participants in the constitution craze, perhaps none more so than Bentham. Where does London fit into this global surge of constitution writing?
Well, London is really important for the spread of constitutions, particularly and most directly in South America in the 1810s and 20s, partly because London is so vast. It's the biggest city on the globe by 1820. It's got the most advanced printing networks. It's got the most advanced and biggest mercantile, marine and port networks. So if you are a revolutionary or if you are a political exile, one very obvious step is to come to London, where there isn't much of a police force at this stage, where on the whole, if you don't muddle with British politics, you'll get left alone. And an awful lot of constitutional writing and constitutional plotting takes place in London. And you see a whole succession of people from Bolivar right up to Lenin and indeed beyond, coming to London, using its facilities and using the transport and information networks of the global British Empire to carry out their own schemes. And this happens again and again. So Britain is at one level out of the game, but very much involved in the game.
So one of the Anglo societies that plays a striking role in your account is Pitcairn Island. What do we need to know about Pitcairn Island, other than being able to locate it on a map, which I imagine most people might have a little bit of difficulty doing?
Well, again, Pitcairn Island is a gem, and it is indeed a very tiny gem. It's where the men from HMS Bounty, with their Tahitian companions, who are mainly female, end up finally here on this tiny rocky island in the South Pacific. And that's fine. But then by the 1830s, you get American whalers landing on Pitcairn, and they say, well, where's your charter? Who do you belong to? Can we come ashore? And at that point, a Scottish naval captain arrives in 1838 and writes the Pitcairners a constitution. So what, you might think? Well, because for the first time, this constitution, which endures until the 1930s, gives women the vote on the same basis as men. And this is quite extraordinary. And I think it also shows, incidentally, how different places influence each other in this constitutional game. The Scottish naval captain is an Enlightenment man, and that's part of the reason he does what he does. But also, the mainly non-white population on Pitcairn at this time has a strong set of Tahitian tradition, and certain Tahitian traditions give women considerable prominence. And also Tahiti's own ruler has been experimenting with his own legal codes. So I think what you've got emerging in this extraordinary episode of Pitcairn in 1838 is a mixture of influences from different parts of the globe.
Yeah, and I mean, there are many, many ways in which constitutions are the means of taking rights away from people, or at any rate, granting rights to some which by extension limit them to others or deny them to others. And yet you do show with Tahiti, with Hawaii, efforts by non-white men or women to assert themselves. Now, how does that fit in with these questions about, about warfare and empire and the ways in which constitutions can be great mechanisms for the, gathering up of power by ravenous states? How do these indigenous sovereignties manage to use constitutions to quite different ends?
Well, sometimes they try and they fail. That often happens. But sometimes not so much. And I suppose the great example about that, which I talk about, is what happens in Hawaii, which is clearly, over the 19th century, increasingly threatened by being taken over by the United States, which of course is what eventually happens. But what the kings of Hawaii tried to do by issuing a constitution, which they first do in 1840, and then there's various Hawaiian constitutions after that, they use these constitutions, which again are published, issued in different languages, sent around the world, to say, look, here we are, an independent monarchy and state, and we are modern, because this is a sign of our modernity. We have a constitution. Therefore, and they expel this out, we are not for the taking. We are not here to be colonized. We have shown that we are civilized, that we are modern, that we can govern ourselves in an advanced way. And so the Hawaiian kings set up a two-house government. The monarch accepts certain constraints. There is a lot of education and printing. And what happens on Hawaii is really quite astonishing. And I was very lucky to benefit from, there's been a great deal of work done in Hawaii in recent decades, because there's a growing Hawaiian nationalist movement, though what will happen to that, we don't know. But as a result, a lot of indigenous sources have been recovered and reinterpreted. And I was able to capitalize on that.
And of course, the great example of a state that you discussed that uses a constitution in this way, but also for empire building and war, is Japan.
Yes, indeed. Japan is increasingly threatened by European, but also American naval power by the 1860s. This partly lies behind what gets to be called the Meiji Restoration, a civil war, but also a mini revolution. And at that point, it is determined by the victors that Japan will have its own constitution, which is eventually implemented in 1889. Now, this is a classic example of a non-democratic constitution. The electorate is tiny. It's a monarchy, and it's also increasingly an empire. As soon as Japan gets its constitution, and it's fast modernizing before that, it starts increasing taxation, it starts building up its army and its navy, it starts expanding into different parts of adjacent land masses like Korea. But Japan becomes, if you like, the poster child of many anti-colonial, anti-Western activists, nationalists in India, in Egypt, in the Ottoman world, and in China, who look at Japan, which is modern in some ways, though not in many others, and successful in war, and has a constitution. So here's a case of a place creating a vital constitution which is going to last until after the Second World War, which is important, which both helps it to become an aggressive empire, but also encourages anti-colonial forces, because it's seen as an example of how a people which is non-Christian, non-white, non-European can play the game.
So, we've just, as it were, kind of talked through the arc geographically and temporally to some extent of this book, and it is sweeping in many ways. And of course, doing a project on this scale requires immense learning and dedication and research. It also requires immense discipline at knowing what to keep out. And I wondered if you could, give us a little bit of insight, perhaps, into things that you made the choice at some point along the way to keep out, to just put to one side, that you wish you could have included, or that you're certain that everybody's going to ask why you didn't include. If you could give us insight into what ended up on the cutting room floor, what else could have been here?
Well, I mean, there's so much that, I could have talked more about India. I could have talked more about Germany. But as you say, global history is incredibly difficult to do. It's fascinating. It's difficult to do. It's also challenging. It's challenging to read because it often outrages national preconceptions. That's part of the reason for doing it. But I suppose at a certain level, I mean, this book took me 10 years to formulate, research, think about, and write. And, I take this opportunity to thank my home university, Princeton, but also to thank, in particular, the history department here, because for 10 years, I have made myself a complete nuisance, I think, to many of my wonderful colleagues, grabbing them in the corridor saying, can you give me a reading list? And is it right to say this? And would I be right to translate that word this way? Because really this is the only way, as you yourself know from your work, that the more you spread yourself, the more you investigate connections and divergences across the globe, the more you become dependent on the kindness of friends and the kindness of strangers.
One of the things that we've discussed about global history before is that, it does spread very widely. And one of the consequences of that is that it tends often to be written through the lenses of economics, politics, diplomacy. It's a little more schematic, shall we say, than the sort of granular type of history characteristic of, for example, cultural historical work. And yet you bring this alive with all kinds of scenes and characters and personalities. How do you, in your own sort of research process and thinking and writing, how does that relationship work for you? The discovery of the scene or the character and the attaching of that scene or character to a larger thematic, idea-driven concern. Do you sort of hit a scene and say, yes, this must be in the book, this is an animating moment? How does it work?
Yeah, and again, I'm sure this strikes bells with you. A lot of it is serendipitous. You come across a beautiful example or a wonderful character. But there is always a danger, which I'm sure I didn't always avoid, of letting your material out of control, letting it become inchoate. And so I had to work out an organizing spine because I wanted also to have a sense of chronology. because that was so important. And I've finally decided that I would organize the book in chapters, each of which began in a place and with a story about people. And that's how I did it. And so, the book starts in Corsica in 1755, and the last main chapter starts in Tokyo on the day of the institution of the Japanese Constitution. But I was determined to bring in people, partly because, and again, I suppose this connects with my desire of getting constitutions out of compartments. I wanted to bring out the literary element of these extraordinary documents. Many of the people who involve themselves in constitutions, Catherine the Great being one example, but Ito Hirobumi, the main author of the Japanese Constitution, would be another, are people who do different kinds of writing. They involve themselves in constitutional documents, but they may do other things. Hirobumi writes poetry. One of the main authors of the Tunisian Constitution of 1861, the first modern type Muslim constitution, he runs a newspaper and he writes books for children. And you see this again and again and again, how people involved in these texts are also involved in other kinds of writing, which I think is important because constitutions have not been looked at in the context of literature. Literary scholars don't address them. Yet, after all, these documents are feeding off many of the things that are also nurturing the explosion of different kinds of literature at this time, not least the novel.
And in certain societies, they become one of the canonical texts that people might have in a household, along with the Bible and Shakespeare and a dictionary or whatever it may be. So yeah, thinking of them as a literary genre is very rich, I think.
Yeah. My example in the book, as you know, is Norway, the 1814 constitution there, the second oldest still extant. And Norwegians are encouraged to paste pages of the constitution on the walls of the inner walls of their houses, both to serve as insulation because Norway is cold, but also so that, the symbolism is extreme. This is a way of domesticating the organization of their state.
So maybe I'll ask just one more question before we turn to the audience, who I'm sure has many questions for you. So in Britons, one of the things that, of course, you argued that what held Britain together was a combination of things which by the late 20th century were not so much in evidence anymore. The empire, the wars with France, and anti-Catholicism, and so on. And sure enough, devolution followed, and many things followed from your arguments in Britons. Turning to this book, which I see very much as a counterpart to Britons, so maybe part one of the question is, do you? But the part two of the question is, famously in the U.S., the reverence for the Constitution has led over the last century or so to an increasing reluctance to amend it. Now, historically, of course, the Constitution in the U.S. has been amended in the wake of the U.S. Civil War and the Progressive Era and so on, but now there's this idea that we can't possibly touch it. Coming back to the role of war and the writing of constitutions, we have in the U.S. now, for almost 20 years, been at war. And I wonder if you see anything about the present state of affairs in the U.S. that may have implications for the mutability of the Constitution in the years ahead?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many fascinating questions there that I'm not quite sure where to start. I think that constitutions face all kinds, I mean, they always have, but there are new challenges to constitutions. The fact that we get our information from screens rather than print on paper is one of them. But also that warfare, of course, has changed. The idea that you need to think out new concessions, new changes to the political system in order to get more men to come up and fight and so forth and so forth. Well, warfare isn't like that anymore. You don't need these great conscript armies in the main. So that's another point. But I actually think in regard to the United States, there is a problem, and Jill Lepore refers to this in her New Yorker piece, with the fact that the US Constitution is very difficult to amend. And the Founding Fathers thought that was a good idea. They thought it would aid stability, but it also aids stasis and things becoming out of date. And you compare this with the other long-lasting constitution, the Norwegian constitution, and they're always changing it. Not saying it's necessarily better, but it is, I suspect, adapted to a 21st century world in a way that the US Constitution no longer is. And there can be a degree, though I realize I'm a mere foreigner, to which reverence can inhibit necessary and creative improvement.
Well, thank you for that. And Dorothea, I think, will MC the questions.
I will, but first I also want to thank both of you for this conversation. It's been really wonderful to listen in on, and I'm glad also, Maya, that you got Linda to talk a little bit about the craft, because it is such an absorbing book because of this marriage between place and people, and then the ideas. So it's all quite wonderful. There are a few questions here in the queue, and I'll just start to pull from them, beginning with one that has been sort of patiently sitting here, actually from before the beginning of this event.
I noticed. Yes, I'm impressed.
Yeah, this comes from John Nash, asking, in what ways do you believe a written constitution has advantages over an unwritten constitution, as we have here in the UK? So welcome, John, from all the way in Britain.
Well, I have to say the divergence between a written constitution and an unwritten constitution is often more rhetorical than real. And actually, by the late 19th century, many American politicians will themselves admit that. They'll say, well, actually, there's a lot of things about the American political system which the US Constitution is not covering. Conversely, of course, in the UK, yes, there's no single codified constitution, but there are lots of important statutes as well as iconic texts, like the Treaty of Union with Scotland, though goodness knows what's going to happen with that in the near future. But I wrote a piece for the Financial Times a week or so ago arguing this, that codified constitutions have their problems. They certainly don't guarantee good government and democracy. You've only got to look around the world to see that. But they can do various things. They are there, available to tell interested citizens how their state is at least supposed to be governed. And a lot of work's been done recently on, for example, the Indian constitution, which is huge. But various people have shown that even quite poor Indians have been able to burrow into that constitution to establish certain rights. Now, you can't do that in Britain because, yes, there's lots and lots of documents, but they haven't been put into a single compact document. You can't check it out. And I think that's a real weakness, particularly given the speed with which the British state is changing at the moment.
Yeah. Let me move on to a question from Harris Durrani. He's picking up on the word, the modern in your title, asking, how did your actors understand or define modernity? Did they tend to advocate alternative modernities, or were there any actors who were critical of the concept of modernity itself? Or, if you have found modernity more useful as a historian's analytic rather than actor's category, how have you understood the term in your approach? And it's also, Harris is thanking you for this wonderful talk.
Well, that again is, of course, a huge theoretical question, which I will not remotely be able to do justice to. I used the modern word in my subtitle, and I realize it's become almost a cliche in book titles, but there you go. Because so many of my actors were using references to the modern, and constitutions did, I mean, this is one reason why I used it, there were others. Constitutions did come explicitly, and obviously in different languages, to be identified with what a modern society would be. And in my penultimate chapter, I quote a Chinese radical during the First World War saying, "It is now clear that no state can be modern and successful without a written constitution." Now, that isn't necessarily true, but it's what people increasingly believe. That said, yes, of course, there are different ways to define what a modern state is. And again, Hawaii tries to do that. Ultimately fails because it's taken over. But one of the things the Hawaiian kings try to do is keep certain aspects of their own indigenous culture and political system, as for example, female chiefs, and have them sitting in the upper house, while also saying we are modern and we have a written constitution. So you can see they don't, of course, theorize it in the way that it is now sometimes theorized. But you can, I think, see non-Western rulers and actors both seeing the attraction and allure of constitution, but also trying to see how they can make it distinctive. And Tunisia, again, does that in 1861, trying to work out the vocabulary which is distinctive, while also using this device in their own way.
Yes, and the questions are now really dropping in unsurprisingly. There are a couple that invite you to think more about specific cases, but I want to just stay with a more general one for another minute here, which picks up on your point that constitutions and democracy don't necessarily go hand in hand. Did you find, Charles Arden is asking, did you find systematic differences in the relationship between war and constitutions in democratic and non-democratic regimes. We often think that only democratic governments offer rights when citizens complain. Did you find that non-democratic regimes were in fact less responsive?
Non-democratic regimes less responsive to what?
It seems to be less responsive to moments of contestation of rights.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I mean, I think it is important, and I think the questioner knows this. Nowhere is particularly democratic in the 18th century. And clearly there are parts of the world that do not involve themselves in constitutions, like the Qing regime in China, where warfare does not stimulate constitution making or political concessions in the same way. But I'm not sure I'm answering this question. That's because I don't fully understand it. But if the questioner would like to put it to me again, I will try and do that.
Yes, let's leave it at that. If there's a follow-up question there that you want to ask, feel free to add that. In the meantime, we'll go to Catherine II as an advocate of constitutions. And the question here is from George Buston, who is currently reading a biography of Metternich, and surprised to find that Metternich proposed a constitution for the Austrian Empire as early as the 1820s, influenced by the Rhenish federal constitutions adopted under Napoleon. So Metternich saw constitutions as inherently conservative, a means of warding off more democratic and nationalistic tendencies. And maybe that actually ties in with the question we were just thinking about. Did the Central European chapter, and Metternich in particular, enter into your research?
No, and this is one more of the things that I leave out. But certainly Metternich is part of a trend you see in many European monarchical states after Napoleon. Because what do you do after Napoleon? Okay, you've defeated him, but by means of the sword, he has introduced his own constitutions all over the place. You can't turn the clock back. And so what many European monarchs and European conservatives like Metternich say is, okay, what we'll do is we'll take this device, but we'll make it serve our own purpose. That's what the returned monarchy in France tries to do with its Charte of 1814. That's what many of the German princes try to do. And they build these constitutions very much around the monarchy. They keep the electorate very small. They may make a few religious concessions. But these are very modest documents, but they can then say, yes, we have a constitution. These are very, well, they're volatile documents, and they are very variable documents.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to a nice question here that invites us to think about those who resisted the writing of constitutions. And this is not sure from whom. Did you encounter many constitutional resistors in your research? Do those opposing the creation of written constitutions share common arguments across different places, suggesting maybe even communication among them?
Oh, lots of people resist constitutions. Sometimes, as in China, because they want to resist change. And I think it's fairly clear that the Chinese Revolution of 1911 happens because the imperial house has resisted constitutions. They initially start promising that they'll introduce one at the end of the 19th century. They make various initial steps, but they won't do it. That's one kind of resistance to the Constitution. But there's also some people are just principled as they see it in their resistance to constitutions, because there is an older view of constitution, of where the law should be, which you can find in the classics, you can find in the Bible, which basically says, and St. Paul talks about this, that the best law is not written on tablets, it is written in the heart. And some British, but also German conservatives, or even sort of middle of the road people, take this view, particularly when they see what's happening with the French Revolution and the instability that's happening in South America. And they say, no, something that's internalized, something that we know in our hearts, will provide the greater stability than what they call, in a derisory way, paper constitution. And they like playing with that idea because, of course, around 1800, paper money was seen as pretty unstable and probably counterfeit. And that argument is sometimes applied to paper constitutions. It's much better to have political principles within.
Yeah. Can I ask tuck in a little question of my own that sort of connects with that? And then there's a nice closing question in the queue. Sorry, we don't have time for all of them. But I was wondering and thinking about all the vivid debate that goes into the writing of the Constitution. I'm always glad to remember that the American Constitution, unlike the Declaration of Independence, does not mention God. But I wonder how prevalent God is in the world's constitutions, and if that is one of those points of common debate and contention.
God is, how can I put this? God tends to be more common in Catholic constitutions. Mm-hmm. And the big change maker here is the Constitution of Cadiz, which is created by opponents in Spain to Napoleon, and it becomes a big influence on many South American emerging republics. But it's also translated into lots of other languages, including, some have suggested, Arabic and Mandarin even. But the makers of the Constitution of Cadiz include a large number of Catholic priests. And they are determined that while Spain will now get its own written constitution, this constitution will not endanger the dominance of the Catholic Church and will not endanger the souls of true believers. And so God figures very strongly in the Constitution of Cadiz and in the many constitutions that fosters across the globe. But you see God receding after the First World War, though not necessarily. The Irish Constitution in the 1930s, the constitution that makes Ireland a republic, is very explicit about God. Mm-hmm. But again, this is a very Catholic constitution. It's even sent to the Pope for his approval.
Also interesting. So we're at the hour. I'm going to close with a question here that is about the inspiration for your book. Is there an historian or a single work that most inspired the development of your book?
I suppose I got sucked into global history by lots of influences, but like lots of people, I was very much impressed by Chris Bailey's great global history of the 19th century and Jürgen Osterhamel's rather different global history of the 19th century. And I learned so much from both of those books, but I also determined to write a rather different global history, which is what I've tried to do.
And have done. So here it is again, this remarkable book. And it's just my task now to thank you for this hour that we've had together, to thank everyone who has logged on. I'm so glad that there's been so many of you. Thank you for your questions. I want to invite you to future events. You can find those on our website, or you can also follow us on this platform and you'll get invitations for that. So I wish that I could be pouring you a glass of wine. I hope that you will. I hope you will pour yourselves one, both of you, all of you, and stay healthy, be well. Many thanks, Linda and Maya.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.